He was 17 years old, good grades, respected by the younger kids at school, a member of the soft tennis club. Nothing about the way he looked or talked or moved would have made you uneasy. On May the 1st, 2000, a national holiday, the start of Golden Week, he walked to a house roughly 100 meters from his school, stepped through an unlocked front door, and killed a 65-year-old woman he had never met. When police asked him why, he said something that stopped Japan in its tracks. "I wanted to try killing someone. No rage, no grievance, no money, just curiosity about what it would feel like." This is the Toyokawa Housewife murder. May 1st, 2000, it was Constitution Day, a public holiday, the opening day of Japan's Golden Week vacation. The streets of Toyokawa, a mid-sized city in Aichi Prefecture, were quieter than usual. Families were at home. People had opened their windows to let in the warm spring air. That evening, a woman was at home with her husband. She was 65 years old. According to Japanese news reports, her name was Kayo Tsutsui. Her husband, Hiroshi, reportedly 67, was home with her. The front door, as it often was on warm days, was left open. A young man stepped inside. He was carrying a hammer. He attacked Kayo Tsutsui with it, and then produced a knife and stabbed her. News coverage reported she was stabbed approximately 40 times. Her husband intervened and was also injured in the struggle. The attacker fled. Kayo Tsutsui died of her injuries. Her husband survived. The following evening, the very next day, a 17-year-old male student walked into the police box outside JR Nagoya Station and turned himself in. He told officers he was the one who had killed the woman in Toyokawa. He was a third-year student at a private high school whose campus was approximately 100 meters from the Tsutsui home. He was taken into custody and processed under Japan's old juvenile law, which at the time applied to any offender under the age of 20. What makes this case so deeply uncomfortable is this. It wasn't impulsive. Nothing about it was a snap decision. It had been thought through. The teenager had chosen the Tsutsui home deliberately. Reports indicate he had walked streets near his school in the days before, looking for an opportunity. He chose the Tsutsui house because the nameplate at the gate gave him the impression that elderly people lived there. According to police accounts, he had already decided he wanted to kill an older person. He reportedly told investigators he thought it would be wrong to kill someone young, someone who still had a future. He had made a moral calculation in his own warped logic about who was acceptable to murder. He also prepared in advance. It is reported that before the day of the crime, he had hidden a change of clothes, his weapons, including the hammer and the knife, and approximately 25,000 yen in cash in a bamboo grove near the scene. The money was for escape. Everything was pre-positioned and waiting. On the morning of May the 1st, he went to school. He sat through his classes. He came home. And then, in the evening, he walked to the Tsutsui house, found the door open, stepped inside, and killed a woman he had never spoken to. Afterward, he went to the bamboo grove, changed his clothes, and left. He had money and a plan. He could have run. It's said that instead, he spent that night and the following day in a kind of stupor. Whether guilt, shock, or something harder to name isn't clear. What is clear is that on the evening of May the 2nd, without being identified, without any evidence pointing directly to him, yet he walked into Nagoya Station and gave himself up. He confessed to everything. Investigators, psychiatrists, journalists, and academics spent the better part of the next year trying to answer the question of why. They kept hitting the same wall. There was no victim. There was no money. There was no prior conflict. There was no deep psychological wound that could be traced to Kayo Tsutsui. She was a complete stranger. He had nothing against her. He had nothing against anyone. The only explanation he ever gave, stated calmly, clearly, and repeatedly, was that he wanted to know what it felt like to kill. In Japanese, the media eventually coined a phrase for it: Taiken Satsujin, experience murder. The concept of killing not for gain, not for revenge, not even out of hatred, but purely to experience an act as a form of self-discovery. To check off something your mind had been orbiting for a long time. That explanation destroyed people's ability to understand what happened. Because if there's no motive in the traditional sense, no story of rejection, no history of violence, no obvious precipitating event, then there is nothing that society can point to and say, that's what caused this, and here's how we prevent the next one. What little emerged about his background painted the picture of someone who looked entirely normal from the outside. He was described by people who knew him as studious and kind. His underclassmen at the tennis club apparently looked up to him. He had no disciplinary record. He had no known history of cruelty to animals, no pattern of aggression, no warning signs that his teachers or classmates ever reported seeing. From the surface, he was exactly the kind of teenager who doesn't end up in any crime story. And yet, the planning, the cold, methodical preparation, the moral framework he had constructed, choosing an elderly victim to minimize, in his own reasoning, the harm he was doing to the world. These were not the actions of someone acting on impulse. This was someone who had been thinking about killing for some time, had resolved to do it, and had thought carefully about how. I want to be honest with you about how limited our knowledge here actually is. The perpetrator was 17, which meant his case was handled entirely within Japan's juvenile law system. At the time, and to this day, those proceedings are sealed. Very little from the official record became public. What we know comes from court rulings, a psychiatric evaluation summary, and journalism, including a book written about the case shortly after it happened. What we do know is that the Nagoya family court ordered a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. That evaluation returned a diagnosis of what the court described as high-functioning pervasive developmental disorder, or Asperger's syndrome. And that term, Asperger's, exploded across Japanese media and public conversation in a way that was damaging and lasting. The narrative took hold almost immediately. This boy had Asperger's, and Asperger's explained the killing. The diagnostic label became a way for people to categorize the incomprehensible, to put something clinical between themselves and the horror. But the court itself explicitly rejected that connection. The ruling handed down on December 26, 2000, stated clearly that the developmental diagnosis was not a cause of the crime. The perpetrator had planned. He had made choices. His condition did not remove his agency or his responsibility. The court ordered him sent to a medical juvenile reformatory with a recommended treatment period of at least 5 years. Autism advocacy groups in Japan spent years afterward trying to undo the damage this case did to public understanding of autism spectrum conditions. The association, Autism Means Danger, had been burned into the public imagination, and correcting it required work that no single court ruling could accomplish. The truth, which had to be restated again and again, is that people with autism spectrum diagnoses are no more likely to commit violent acts than the general population, and are in fact more frequently victims of violence than perpetrators. So if the diagnosis doesn't explain it, what does? I want to offer this not as a clinical assessment, but as one possible interpretation. What the case seems to show is someone who had developed, over time, a profound inability or unwillingness to perceive other human beings as fully real. Kayo Tsutsui was not, to him in the moment he stepped through her door, a grandmother or a neighbor or a woman with a name and a history. She was a category, elderly, female, home alone, that fit his criteria. She was an object of curiosity, not a subject with an interior life. That kind of moral blindness, the failure to perceive another person's reality as equivalent to your own, does not belong exclusively to any diagnosis. It can exist quietly inside someone who looks completely ordinary. And it can exist alongside other qualities: intelligence, the appearance of kindness, the social mimicry that makes a person seem well-adjusted. The boy held all of that. And underneath it, apparently, something essential was absent. The court offered one line that has stayed with people who followed the case. In justifying the reformatory sentence, the judges wrote that the crime was the fulfillment of an unreasonable desire, but that the perpetrator showed sincere reflection and remorse, and that it was in society's interest to allow for his rehabilitation through treatment. They chose to see him, despite everything, as someone who could be reached. Whether he was, is not part of the public record. The Toyokawa case didn't happen in isolation. It was the opening act of one of Japan's most unsettling years. 2 days after the killing, on May 3, 2000, a 17-year-old in Fukuoka Prefecture hijacked a commuter bus at knife point and drove it for hours through western Japan, killing one passenger and injuring others. Another month brought another incident. And another. Japanese media had a name for it by summer. Kirei Ruju Nanasai, the snapping 17-year-olds. The phrase described a perceived epidemic of adolescent violence, crimes committed by teenagers who seemed to come from nowhere and who offered explanations, or no explanations at all, that adults couldn't process. That moral panic had consequences. In November 2000, Japan revised its juvenile law, lowering the minimum age for criminal referral from 16 to 14. It was a direct response to the year's events, and the Toyokawa case was central to the debate. Whether the reform made Japan safer is a question criminologists have debated ever since. What's harder to dispute is that it reflected a society that felt its youth were becoming incomprehensible. What the case also left behind is an object lesson in how a diagnosis, introduced in the wrong context and without proper framing, can do lasting damage. Asperger's syndrome became shorthand, in the Japanese public mind, for something threatening, and that mischaracterization took years to begin to undo. The people harmed by that weren't perpetrators of anything. They were people navigating ordinary lives who suddenly found themselves looked at differently. And then there's Kayo Tsutsui, 65 years old, a woman who left her front door open on a warm spring afternoon because it was a holiday, and because she had no reason to think the world had become that kind of place. She never had a chance to understand what was happening. She never even knew why. I wanted to try killing someone. Some reasons can't be closed because there's no door to shut them behind, and that, more than anything else in this case, is what stays with you. Thank you for watching. If this one found you somewhere you weren't expecting, if it left something unresolved in your chest, that's the point. These cases resist simple explanations. The ones that resist the hardest are the ones worth staying with. Subscribe if you want to keep looking at the hard ones.